You know, the history of the Indian subcontinent is usually this grand story of slow expansion and gradual decline. But today's explainer looks at something entirely different. We're diving into the Sena Dynasty, a medieval empire that experienced a meteoric rise and a stunningly rapid collapse. It's a fascinating study in statecraft, religion, and culture, and the whole thing unfolded over just about 130 years in the region of Bengal.
So here's the central paradox we're going to unpack today. How did an empire that unified millions and literally birthed a cultural golden age lose its capital to a few dozen men on horseback? We're going to trace a real-life historical tragedy that forever changed the cultural fabric of South Asia, transforming the religious and social landscape in ways that, honestly, we can still see today.
Section 1. The Power Vacuum and the Decline of the Palace.
To really get how the Senas built their empire, we first have to look at the crumbling world they inherited back in the late 11th century. For centuries, Bengal and Bihar were completely dominated by the mighty Pala dynasty. Now, the Palas were a massive Buddhist empire, famous for endowing these great monastic universities. But by the 11th century, they were declining, heavily fractured by something called the Kaivarta Rebellion. And this perfectly set the stage for our rising stars, the Sena family. The Senas were a Brahmanical Hindu family, essentially a rising provincial military aristocracy coming out of the Rata region in western Bengal. So as the Palas lost their grip, this highly ambitious military family saw an opening and seized their moment.
But here's the thing. Before they were emperors, they were just vassals. The dynasty's founder, Samanta Sena, wasn't actually a king at all. In fact, the word Samanta literally translates to a feudal chief or vassal lord, and this was the original subordinate status of the Sena family. They just served under Pala suzerainty as local military commanders or landholders. It just goes to show that massive empires often start from surprisingly humble provincial origins, quietly biding their time until the central authority weakens.
Section 2. Forging the empire across 3 generations. It's amazing to see how this family transformed local authority into absolute paramountcy over 3 incredibly dynamic generations. In 1095 CE, Hamanta Sena takes that crucial first step, formally assuming sovereign royal titles. But the true architect of the empire? That's his son, Vijaya Sena. During an incredibly long 60-year reign, Vijaya Sena embarks on this massive military expansion. He ousts rival dynasties like the Varmans and achieves the rare feat of unifying Bengal's highly complex, river-cut geography under a single ruling house. Next, Balala Sena steps in to consolidate that power and enacts sweeping social reforms. And finally, Lakshmana Sena takes over, presiding over the empire's ultimate cultural zenith.
Section 3. The Cultural Golden Age of Literature and Society.
Now with the borders secured and the rival kings defeated, the Sena court evolved dramatically. Balala Sena didn't just rule the land, he systematically reorganized Bengali Hindu society from the ground up. He's traditionally credited with implementing a system called Kulinism. Think of it as a strict ranking of lineages or kulas based entirely on criteria of ritual purity and Brahmanical learning. Highly prescribed marriage practices were rigorously enforced, and superior social status was conferred only to those who met the absolute highest orthodox standards. And this wasn't just some temporary political maneuver, this was a hierarchical framework that survived well into the modern era, deeply shaping Bengali communal identity.
His son, Lakshmana Sena, inherited this highly organized, very prosperous state and pushed it even further. He was actually the first to adopt the incredibly resounding imperial title of Gaudeshwara, which means Lord of Gauda. It was a massive projection of absolute self-confidence. The Sena kings were no longer just regional strongmen, right? They viewed themselves as the undisputed, paramount authority over the whole of Bengal, extending their influence far beyond their traditional heartland.
Under Lakshmana Sena's watch, the court just became this dazzling hub of literature and art. Tradition tells us his court was graced by these 5 gems of Sanskrit letters. But the most famous among them, without a doubt, is Jayadeva. He's the author of the Gita Govinda, a sensuous and deeply influential piece of devotional poetry that went on to shape Vaishnava literature, music, and dance across the entire subcontinent. But as we're admiring all this incredible literary genius, we absolutely have to remember a crucial, fatal vulnerability. The king patronizing them was aging, and out on the frontiers, they were quietly being left completely unguarded.
Section 4. A Shocking Collapse and the Fall of Nabadweep.
And this brings us to a catastrophic turning point right around 1204 to 1205 CE, and it unfolded with terrifying speed. While the Senas were busy composing poetry, the political landscape of northern India was violently shifting. The gored military machine was sweeping eastward. A Turkish adventurer named Bakhtiyar Khalji led this rapid, totally stealthy cavalry raid from Bihar directly to the gates of the Sena capital, Nabadwip. Khalji was completely exploiting the absence of a Sena early warning system. They simply did not see him coming.
Incredible as it sounds, literally, you almost can't believe it. Chronicler Minhaj-e-Siraj reports that Khalji breached the city with just a handful of horsemen. It's reported he arrived with only 18 men in his vanguard, disguised as simple horse traders. They basically walked right past whatever defenses existed before the alarm could even be raised.
The resulting panic was just absolute. While Lakshmana Sena was literally sitting down to eat his midday meal, the capital fell in a single afternoon. Taken entirely by surprise, the aged king fled by boat down the river. He abandoned his capital, his treasury, his household, everything. He made a desperate retreat to the riverine safety of eastern Bengal, leaving the entire western half of his empire to the invaders.
So if you're wondering how a massive empire literally collapses in a single day, it really comes down to a perfect storm of structural vulnerabilities. Militarily, the Senas were relying on slow elephant and infantry forces, which were utterly outmatched by highly mobile, mounted archery Turkish cavalry. Administratively, they were highly decentralized. They didn't have a standing professional army ready to repel sudden incursions. Geopolitically, they were totally isolated on the eastern periphery without any defensive coordination with neighbors. And finally, royal demographics played a huge role. The advanced age of Lakshmana Sena meant the state was effectively paralyzed the second a sudden crisis hit.
Section 5. An enduring legacy that goes beyond extinction.
Now, following that disastrous raid, the Sena Dynasty shrank down to a minor regional power in the eastern delta, and they faded away entirely by the 1230s. But their story doesn't actually end there. The reason all of this matters to you today is that the Senas essentially forged the socio-religious template of modern Bengali Hindu identity. They drove the decisive reassertion of Brahmanical Hinduism over Buddhism in the region. They entrenched Kulin marriage practices that lasted well into the modern era. They catalyzed the massive spread of devotional traditions. And Jayadeva's Gita Govinda became a foundational text for classical dance, music, and poetry across the entire subcontinent, proving that at the end of the day, their cultural policies were far, far stronger than their armies.
It's a pretty provocative thought to end on, right? What matters more to history? The walls you build or the ideas you leave behind? The Sena Dynasty is basically the ultimate historical irony. An empire that couldn't defend its own front door managed to cultivate literature, social frameworks, and religious traditions that outlived it by centuries. They lost their capital in a single afternoon, but they secured a legacy that has lasted a millennium.